beginning with Syed Ahmed Khan in India, and I thought I would give a brief background of India as it was in the 19th century and dipping back earlier. Now, the British began as traders in India in 1600. They then administered trade routes in 1687 for the British government. I want to see how I advance the slides here. They weren't the only ones interested in India, and the French also had entered as traders. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 was between the British and the French, basically over trade. Sirajuddin Dowlah, the Muslim governor of Bengal, allied with France, and he lost, and the French lost as the British gained power. And so in British India, I just wanted to take a look of who benefited and who did not. As I like to think that British rule was efficient rule, but from the perspective of the Indians, it had great benefits financially and materially, but it only served a percentage, the elite, the upper class Indians. It brought order and stability, led to a fairly honest government, set up principally an excellent school system for the elite with the goal to train Indian children to serve in the government and army. But above all, you found that it inaugurated railroads, telegraph, and postal systems. I'm going to have to figure out a way to, okay, here we are. We can advance the slides. One area in education that I so appreciated, I grew up in Bangladesh. My father was a professor at the University of Dhaka, was the really excellent Indian colleges. Serampore University, established by William Carey, Joshua Marshman, and William Ward, still churns out thousands of graduates every year. I was considering applying to Serampore University myself, and finally came back to the States. But another aspect of British India was the railroads. Nowhere else in any other country do I know where one system so transformed a nation. And the railroad affected the culture, just practically every aspect of life, and still does. Of course, when the British came, they developed the tea culture and tea plantations. Well, again, those who benefited and tolerated from British governance and British life were the few, and those who didn't were the many. Sooner or later, it became very apparent that efficient rule was not a substitute for home rule, but rather led to humiliation and struggle. And here you have upper class Indian subservient to the British Army. Now, into this mix came two thinkers, two administrators. And I like to think of their lives as symbiotic lives, because they dealt with such similar problems. Now, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, KCSI, was a Muslim reformer, educationist, and philosopher in 19th century India. In 1938, he entered the service of the East India Company and went on to become a judge in 1867, retiring in 1876. Now, during the Indian Mutiny of 1857, it's interesting that Khan remained loyal to the British Raj and was noted for his actions in saving European lives. After the rebellion, he penned the very, very interesting booklet, The Causes of the Indian Mutiny, which was a daring critique at the time of various British policies that he blamed for causing the revolt. The other person I like to compare is Sir William Muir. Now, both worked for the British Raj at first, and then for the British government. Sir William Muir, KCSI, born 1819 to 1905. He also was an Orientalist, colonial administrator, lieutenant governor of the Northwest provinces of British India. And he stood firmly, actually, against the edict of Lord Palmerston, 1784-1865, who wrote to Lord Canning, then in India, following the Indian mutiny that, quote, every building connected with Mohammedan tradition should be leveled to the ground without regard to antiquarian veneration or artistic predilection. And he stood firmly, Muir stood firmly against that. And that caught Sir Syed Ahmed Khan's attention. Here was a British administrator at the highest level who was standing firm on what was ethically right for the Muslim Indian populace. Now, Muir's strong stand preserving Muslim shrines and heritage had an impact on Syed Ahmed Khan. And later on, after the war, after 1857, there was a huge degree of animosity between Indian Muslims and their British governors. Syed Ahmed Khan argued that India was not Dar al-Islam, the land of Islam. It was not Dar al-Harb, the land of struggle. It is simply British India, where Muslims were protected, and as such, Dar al-Amin or Dar al-Dhimma. It's the home for security or protection. And in doing that, in so arguing, he saved thousands of lives of Europeans, British and others. Muir and Khan were interested in how they could bring the two communities, the Indian Muslims and Indian peoples and the British together. And they initially thought by education to solve some of these religious divides. And Muir arranged for land to be given for a Muslim college. Sir Syed Ahmed Khan sought establish this famous college. Oops, if we can go back there. And I do not know how to reverse this. But thank you.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they together, but Sir Syed Ahmed Khan established the first college for Muslims in India. Also literature, to study comparative theology, Muslim and Christian studies at that very early period, if you will. Now, Sir William Muir began to investigate. He previously wrote on history, but from 1819, but he began to investigate admitted truths. That is, truths admitted in the Quran and the Bible. And Sir Syed Ahmed Khan also began to write about admitted truths in the Quran and the Bible in his first phase of his literary journey. The person that actually much later brought these ideas together in India was William Goldsack. Now, Muir's religious writings from 1857 to 1870 began to stress the importance of Islamic sources in Muslim and Christian dialogue using truths admitted in the Quran and the Bible. When I say admitted truths, I mean ideas in the Quran, for example, about Jesus, Surah 19, born of a virgin. Why? So he could be sinless, Surah 19:20. 2 messianic titles for Jesus, Surah 4, 171. Kalimatuhu, his word, that is God's word. Isa Ruhullah, God's spirit. All these concepts in the Quran you find reflected in the Bible. And we call these truths admitted in the Quran and the Bible. So Muir at that time wrote the Quran, its composition and teachings, which uses truths admitted in the Quran to give evidence for the reliability of the biblical text. Now, Khan at that time undertook to check the validity of the Quran and Hadith. In doing so, he decided to study the Bible on its own terms, not critically, and this resulted in a serious bilingual commentary on the Bible entitled The Mohammedan Commentary on the Holy Bible, Tabi'an al-Kalam fi Tafsir al-Tawrat wal Injil al-Millat al-Islam. And that was published in 3 parts between 1862 and 1865. In this commentary, translated by Khan from Urdu into English, at that time, he denies that the Bible had been corrupted or abrogated. Volume 2 is a commentary on the first 11 chapters of Genesis, while volume 3 is a commentary on Matthew 1 through 5. And I hope that Charles, who is actually producing this and commenting on this, will have more to say. In this work, Syed Ahmed Khan points out truths in the Bible which agree with those in the Quran, i.e. admitted truths. Hali says that Syed Ahmed Khan's main aim was to go right to the source of Christian religion, the Bible and its teachings, the revealed scriptures, as he held then, and explain them in terms of Islam, the final revealed religion. Well, the importance of this Tabi'an al-Kalam can't be overestimated, really. The importance of Khan's original commentary was to study the biblical scriptures in the context of the Quran and in the terms of Islam, i.e. along an Islamic axis. And Khan's conclusions, very noteworthy, were while there is evidence in the Quran of wrong reading of the biblical text, there is no evidence that the text of the Bible itself was willfully altered, nor did Khan regard the Bible abrogated by the Quran. Nashk. Thirdly, Khan expresses his acceptance of the miracles of Christ in the Tabi'an and retains many traditional Christian views, which, by the way, he later discounts in his tafsir, his commentary on the Quran written after 1870. Please note that date. It's a very important date in the study of the life of Syed Ahmed Khan, and here's why. Now, in 1870, this is well after the war, or the first war of independence, as some of us like to call it, or the Indian Mutiny. Ahmed Khan, upon returning from England, where he was influenced, by the way, for his 2 years of study by the skeptical views of Thomas Carlyle, who was a rationalist and an anti-deist and anti-theist also. And Khan changed his theological method to conform to rationalism. He thereafter rejects the idea that any religion, including Islam, could be accepted on the basis of miracle. This was after his 2-year discourse with Thomas Carlyle. When his newfound rationalism was applied to the Bible, it was by and large accepted. But when he applied it to the Quran, it caused a furor. So Khan contended he had to find a way to accept Islam. And he contended that one could nevertheless accept Islam on the basis of Muhammad's profound thoughts and holy life, i.e., as written in the Hadith. So in some manner, his Islam became more Hadithic than Quranic. The third period of Khan's thinking, between 1880 and 1895, Khan wrote the Tafsir al-Quran, the commentary on the Quran in 6 volumes. In the Tafsir, he begins the process of demythologizing the miracles about Jesus, which he had previously endorsed in the Tabi'an al-Kalam. And in the Tabi'an al-Kalam, written before 1870, I'll remind you that Khan had accepted the concept of the virgin birth of Jesus as it's found support in Surah 3, Surah 19, Maryam Surah, elsewhere. After his denial of the supernatural nature of Jesus following 1870, he rescinds this statement in the Tafsir, stating, quote, "The disciples of Jesus knew and accepted that he was proceeded from the seed of Joseph." So it's interesting to do a comparison of Khan's writings before 1870 and after 1870. At the time of his writings, the Tabi'an al-Kalam, he held there is no special relationship between Jesus and the Spirit of God, as the Quran also states, Jesus is Spirit of God, Ru'Allah, Apostle of God, Rasul Allah. And in this sense, he can also be named, quote, Son of God, at the time of writing of the Tabi'an al-Kalam. However, in his Tafsir, he explains this, or tries to explain it, that the origin of Christ's epithet, quote, Son of God, was that among the Greeks, it was commonly held that a very holy and reverend person should be called, quote, Son of God. Heracles, Romulus, Pythagoras, Plato are all called in the Greek sense, sons of God. And so the title Son of God was simply an honorific title, Greek title, as the Bible was written in Greek. So again, in the Tabi'an al-Kalam, written before 1870, Khan accepted the concept of the virgin birth of Jesus, finding support in the Quran, Surah 3, Surah 19. After the denial of the supernatural nature of Jesus following 1870, he rescinds this statement in the Tafsir, stating, the disciples of Jesus knew and accepted that he proceeded from the seed of Joseph.
It was going the wrong, the slides were going the wrong way.
Oh,
so
I'm sorry.
that's why.
Okay. And similarly with the crucifixion of Christ, in the Tabi'an, he held the typical Sunni interpretation, namely that someone was substituted in the place of Jesus on the cross, and Jesus himself was taken up to heaven before he died and will return to earth as Mahdi. Now, in regards to the crucifixion in the Tafsir al-Quran, Khan contends after 3 or 4 hours, Christ was taken down from the cross, and it is certain that at that moment he was very much alive. Then the disciples concealed him in a very secret place out of fear of the enmity of the Jews, and they spread the rumor that Christ had ascended to heaven. Thus, the crucifixion remained an enigma for Syed Ahmed Khan. Well, you see his literary journey from a belief about Jesus fairly coincident with the Gospels, and one which actually denied Jesus as being a divine being in any sense, and finally one which rejected all miracle, as in coincidence with rationalism. Now, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan's literary journey mapped out a path for further future apologists in Muslim India. And of course, if you take his ideas and pair them with Fander's and his interlocutor, you find some of these same ideas. And it's worth doing a comparative study of apologetics from Khan's period forward. Thank you very much. And this is a brief introduction to Khan's thinking and his writing. And I turn it over to Dr. Charles Ramsey, who has written a very important volume on Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. I believe he will take these ideas forward.
Thank you, David. That was so good to hear. Very enriching, and you connected the dots. And I particularly liked your title when I saw it. I write in three worlds. Did I say that correctly? And in our original conversation, we started thinking of the phases of his life, and I think that's a good way to think of the title and the changes he goes through. But one distinctive thing about Sir Syed, as he's often known, is that he was very cognizant that he was at once addressing his own people, Indians, whether they're primarily Muslim, but of the different communities, Hindus, Sikhs, and others, simultaneously addressing British colleagues that he worked with in the East India Company and in different social venues where he interacted. And then he was also addressing those who didn't necessarily fall in one camp or the other, but were sharing with him this journey of being transnational, of people who at once were firmly rooted in their own homeland and their own culture, but were engaged with the world. And so when I come at thinking about his own intellectual journey, his religious journey, spiritual journey, his journey as an author, I like to keep that in mind, that he inhabited a time when the world was changing and changing quickly. In his youth, he lived in Mughal Delhi. And it was a place where, the old ways still continued. There were British there. There were people like the resident, Akhtar who would come to his home, but Akhtar was fluent in Persian and in Hindustani. He was married to an Indian wife. He rode elephants and dressed in local clothing. Sir Syed Ahmed Khan's father was a Sufi, died in the war, left the family to serve and to literally sleep at the feet of his spiritual master. And his family loved classical Sufism, the writings of Ibn al-Arabi, and were considered themselves to be in the spiritual lineage, particularly on his mother's side, of Sheikh Ahmed Sirhindi. So this wasn't just an average family of shopkeepers. I mean, it's important to think that Syed Ahmed Khan's maternal grandfather was the only person allowed to remain seated or to be seated in the presence of the Mughal. And there's great stories of him shampooing the Mughals' feet as they would sit and talk and conspire. And he was an ambassador to Iran. He was himself an educator and a polymath. So he grew up in a home that was already engaged in interesting ideas. For example, Ram Mohan Roy, who was the famous translator of Sanskrit texts into Persian, which was in itself challenging, to say the least, for his Brahmin kinsmen, but also began translating and engaging some of the sayings of Jesus, trying to demythologize those. Says, what would happen if we took the sayings of Jesus out of narrative and out of the story, and consequently the doctrines that are formed? What if we just took what he said and pulled that apart and just looked at the ethical teachings? Ram Mohan Roy is in Sir Syed's home as when he's a child. So we can see this place of convergence in Delhi where he's growing up, where new ideas are coming, world thinkers, world leaders, people of influence and consequence are coming through his doors. And so he grows up in that environment, but very much a product of his world. And in that first phase, as Dr. Coffey, I think, rightly pointed out, there's a young man who's engaging with his own faith. And even in 1839, we see him writing about the life of the beloved prophet, as he would say, in polishing the hearts of the beloved. He's referring to that. But even there, when he's trying to understand more about the life of the prophet, and he's excising, he's removing from the stories and from his writing and challenging some of the more fabulous accounts of the life of the prophet that seem to be ridiculously glorified. And there was a lot of that going on. It was consistent in Sir Syed's life and in his environment to have a critical approach to sources. If you go into more of my writing, then you're always going to come across the house of Shah Waliullah and the Madrasa Rahimia, who were right there in Delhi, and who in the 100 years before Sir Syed, in the environment that he would later pursue learning in at the Jamia Masjid, the central mosque there in Delhi, they were engaged in critical studies of the text. They had a scriptural philosophy that said, we need to get back to the text. What is the Quran saying? That is the place that brought about the first vernacular translations into Persian of the Quran, for example. And then subsequently, the sons of Shah Waliullah are going to translate it into Hindustani, into Urdu. And so it's a desire to translate the text into the language of the people that's understandable, even for a shopkeeper can hear this and understand the meaning. So it's a movement to taking the miraculous text and bringing it down into the language and the understanding of people. So that's the environment he's in. And in that first world, that first phase of his life, he is grappling with these changes. But I think we have to be careful about saying that his shift in thinking and his adoption of rationalism was brought about only by his encounter with the British. That might be a point where you and I disagree. I believe that he had already begun that change before 1870, before he travels to Britain, before he interacts with Carlyle. I think some of those changes are already happening. When we look at his writings on the New Testament, which is Tabyin al-Kalam, the part 3 is how it's published, even though it was the very first to be written. It's written possibly even before the fighting and the War of 1857. It gives a very early account, and he is very clear that miracles happened, that Jesus had a miraculous birth, a virgin birth. He's very clear, even there, on the physical death of Jesus. He doesn't make any pushback on that at all. He is very clear that Jesus heals the sick, casts out the demons. So miracles are accepted in part 3. Christian doctrine is not. He is not accepting Christian doctrine. He's accepting the text, and he's reading the text with great seriousness. But in that first phase, he is not. By 1863, when he's working on part 2 of which is a study of Genesis and a study, kind of an introduction to what Christians would call the Old Testament, you know, the Hebrew Bible. By then, he's already trying to demythologize the text. He's looking at accounts of Genesis and reading these, looking for metaphorical, psychological significance in that. So he's going to take an approach to that. And it's fascinating to see he's quoting and he's engaging with European sources at this time. And we have access to his journey of borrowing those from people who are at seminaries and Bible colleges, but also colleagues and friends, certainly like William Muir and those. He's taking the books he can find and engaging with the text. So we see that very, very interestingly and very clearly. But we also notice in this time 2 important things. A deepening of his cosmology. He's asking the question, how can I reconcile revelation, right, with the world I see around me, with science and with the observable, simple, plain truth? And that makes him a man of his age. Those questions were happening everywhere during that time, all across Europe and over in the US where I am. Everyone's starting to address those questions with great seriousness. And in a world that's connected through writings and translations and newsprint. So he is active in that conversation. Sir Syed, being Sir Syed, however, is not going to simply steal someone's idea. I believe that he's going to go back into his own religious tradition. So when I read his commentary on Genesis, I hear and I detect over and over again an appeal, sometimes not directly, but sometimes through the choice of term and through the ideas introduced, an appeal to Persian philosophy, an appeal to the ancients from within his own tradition. And so when we see that, we sense that grappling that's happened. One of the historians from Aligarh, the college that you cited and showed us a picture of, Tariq Hassan, likes to use the word raju or rajuat. Raju is the idea of changing course. So, for example, in let me get I want to say 1847, Sir Syed writes a book where he's just vehemently arguing the old Ptolemaic understanding of how the solar system works. The Earth is at the center. 1 year later, only 1 year later, he writes a second book where he completely reverses his course and admits his error and states that it's affirmation of the Copernican model where the sun is at the center. So in 1 year, he makes a change. Tariq Hassan is going to say this is characteristic of his honesty, his integrity, and his willingness to be a public scholar. And I think we see that throughout his journey. He gives us a lot of clues along the way of his willingness to expose his journey. Now, I want to emphasize that the idea of rajuat and the idea of this changing is not capitulation. I don't like this sense that he's unpredictable, irrational, or his changes don't make any sense. No, I don't buy that at all. I see him as a consistent, long-term thinker, a plotter, but one who is willing to admit error and admit changes in his thinking. And so we sense that. But with that in mind, I think that from those periods in the 1830s and the 1840s, there's a slow, long journey to rationalism that becomes more bold and more confident as he goes. And by the time he gets into that final phase, which is arguably his longest phase of writing that we see in his commentaries of the Quran, he has a mature Islamic rationalism that I believe is uncomfortable to many, but is still consistent with his roots, with his intellectual roots from North India among the Sunni Muslim community. That is a cosmology that he's working from. And his basic cosmology is that supernatural events do not happen. That is inconsistent with God's work. God's work and God's word, he says, are always consistent. And if they seem to be inconsistent, then we humans and our perceptions are the ones who have not matured enough in our learning to grasp and to comprehend what God is doing. So
may I ask a quick question? Sorry,
yes,
Charles.
please. Yes,
may
please.
I ask a quick question to both of you, which this is interesting. Maybe it has two parts. The first part is whether it's from his visit to Britain or also from his access to European books. It sounds like but I think you're qualifying this, Charles. His rationalism comes from European influence. But are you saying that it's not as that's not entirely so?
I would say that's not entirely so. I would say that there is definitely a challenge from Christian early writers and thinkers within his context. But as the question is seated, the question becomes his own. And I think his journey is his own as well. So I don't think his answer, though many have accused him of this, many Muslims and Christians have accused him of simply adopting a Western view of rationalism. I would qualify, I'd say the questions might have come from there and his answers might be similar, but that his approach to reaching those answers are consistent with his own intellectual traditions. The answers that he has to give to himself come from the Islamic tradition.
David, do come in on this if you wish. Then I have a supplementary question too.
Yes. Yes, I find it interesting, Charles, that he took a firm position on the miraculous in the first period. In the last period, he denied the miraculous, even though it be in the Islamic context. And of course, many Islamic scholars took umbrage to those diametrically opposite positions. So he found a way to bring those two positions together by saying, well, yes, but I will turn to the hadith in affirming Islam rather than the miraculous as espoused in the Quran and of course in the Bible. So I do find him going outside the text, which is in the text of the Quran, and of course outside the text of the Bible, to reach a rationalistic conclusion, a denouement, as it were, and he did so by adopting particular hadiths, but not those which were actually with his basis in Sunni Islam.
Mm. Could I ask you then a quick follow-up question on that? So he wrote, as you said, Charles, his commentary on Matthew's Gospel, which is very interesting. He wrote that quite early. When he looks back in later life, this is a question to either of you, does he comment on it or disavow that, or say, well, I accepted those things then, but of course I don't now, things like the virgin birth, given that he seemed to have such a major change. Does he comment on how he regarded that Bible work, if you want to call it that, which was mid-career rather than the last decades?
Shall I go on? Or would you like
okay, yeah, and then David, yeah.
Okay. I don't see him disavowing that. We have access to many of his earlier writings through a compendium of writings, where an oeuvre, if you will, where he brings them and republishes them. So he's very intentional of providing readers access to his writings in a consolidated volume. So there's an intentionality. If he wanted to do away with those, he could have and made them inaccessible. So there's a willingness to bring those forward. In Tafsir, his finest and longest writing, he does not comment much or disavow the text, but he very clearly articulates a different view. He very clearly articulates a different understanding of how some of those things happen. But what is fascinating throughout his commentary on the Quran is quotations and extensive appeals to the biblical text to make his points. And I think that's what's fascinating, including, as David rightly brought forward, his views of the crucifixion and of the cross. And he goes in extensively to different commentaries and to passages in the Bible. He draws a cross in his commentary on the Quran, so you can see what he's talking about, includes the symbol in there. But he also, from my reading of it, provides three possible outcomes of the cross. And again, he does that from Muslim sources. But to what David's saying, I think on appeal to hadith, we're all inconsistent as human beings. At least I am. You all might be better than I am. But we have these ideas, and to understand Sir Syed, and he's very clear in his introduction to his commentary on the Quran, he says, I am inviting all Muslims and thinkers of goodwill to think with me on the principles of exegesis by which we could agree upon, and from there we could approach any revealed scripture. Let's agree first to our methodology, and then let's take the methodology to the text. That way, when we get to a miraculous account or something that is unclear to us, we're all working from the same basic agreed upon rules and parameters, so that when we get to a miraculous event, such as the birth, the virgin birth, we can say, well, let's apply principle number 2 and say, well, this would be supernatural. We know that humans are not born this way. Therefore, we need a metaphorical explanation for what's being stated here. And so for him, one of those key principles is that whatever God revealed in Scripture is always consistent with what he revealed in natural law. So if we can see it plainly and simply in the way the universe works, then we have to not put our reason aside. We have to read what's being said in light of what we all can plainly see. And that changes how we find the meaning of the text. So that's at the heart of what he's saying. Now, he's going to say the miraculous still happens, but he's going to say there's a difference between the miraculous and the supernatural. Yeah, human life is miraculous. The fact that you take a seed and put it in the soil and it bears fruit, a tree comes up or food comes up, that the rain comes when it comes, that there are seasons. Say we live in a miraculous world, a divine infused world. But the idea that we just, that God willy-nilly presses pause on the rules and inserts his own power, God's own will and direction, circumventing God's own rules is inconsistent, he would say, with reason and with our understanding of God. So that becomes at the center of how he sees everything and how he interprets the text.
Could I just let David in? Do you want to say anything more, David, about how he saw his biblical work? Because it's a fascinating episode in Muslim intellectual history.
He saw his biblical studies and Quranic studies. He would not say, in my opinion, that he has disavowed miracle. He would say that he has reinterpreted miracle. And that's how he was getting around his particular critiques from his Muslim colleagues. And what Christians might say, yes, he did avow the miraculous, what I would say. But the important question is, did his Muslim colleagues feel like he was disavowing the miraculous, for example, in the Quran? And many said he was. He said, no, I'm reinterpreting the miraculous so it fits with the reasoned world. And so I think when one asks the question of does he disavow the miraculous, you have to look at his interpretation of the miraculous. And it's actually far closer to rationalism in the end, to me, than it is. He's reinterpreting it to fit a reasoned point of view rather than not. So anyway, that's my position. According to the Bible, he probably did disavow the miraculous. According to Islam, as he suggested, his position was he reinterpreted it.
Thank you. So in a way, he applies that to the Quran and the Bible.
Yes,
equally.
and
So
as he said, no religion can be influenced by the miraculous. As we live in the world and we interpret things, we must reinterpret things according to the physical. So yes, I think he pretty much acknowledged himself that he's reinterpreting the miraculous to be consonant with rationalism. And I would like to hear Charles comment on that particular statement.
Maybe if you comment on that, Charles, and then we'll move towards opening it up to questions from the floor.
I think it's important to remember that in Christian apologetics, from these missionaries and people who were living in that context, the main reasoning, when the message of Christianity was being presented, was the proof of the veracity of Christ and the power of Christ is in the miracles. And so we look at, I believe it's William Muir's brother, John. Is that correct, David? John Muir was his brother. One of his most famous texts was the evidence for Christ is in his miracles. And so there's this sense that our prophet has more miracles than yours, therefore we win and you lose. That seemed to be the argument. And Syed Ahmed Khan is looking at the text and saying, yeah, we do not present our prophet as a miracle worker. That was not his claim to fame. That was not his in fact, the miracle was the Quran itself, the ability to faithfully articulate and utter the Quran, is the miracle of Islam. Now, that is a very complicated line to argue, because if you're going to seriously deal with reason and revelation, and if your ultimate miracle is the text itself, then to deny the place of miracles or of the supernatural is to deny the supernatural essence of the Quran itself. And so you can see the meticulous care needed to grapple with this, right? And so because there's a reverence for the text, and for the text to itself have a very, very unique and special status, but not be supernatural. And that is at the heart, I think, of what Sir Syed is dealing with. How does one account for the process by which that which is outside of the system, that which is in God, in Allah, to come into the world of humanity? How does one account for that process of revelation and still uphold a basic rationality and a basic understanding of cause and effect? He emphasized over and over again in his writing.
But you really can't have it both ways. It can't be miraculous at one point in history and non-miraculous at another point in history when referring to the same event.
Well, the event is, I think, from his perspective, accessible to us in a text. And we need to not, he would, I think, we need to do justice to the text. We need to do justice by reading it correctly, reading it from a pure heart and with pure eyes. To read the text well, I think, is at the heart of it. You know, it's interesting, David, when we read early Christians in this context, 1882, 1883, they're reading Sir Syed's writings on the Bible, and they're deeply offended. They would say, he is worse than Rahmatullah Kairanvi. Why? Is it because he offends the text and says the text is wrong? No, it's because he reinterprets the text, and by doing that disarms and rationalizes, humanizes Jesus, makes the miracles simple metaphors. And so I think this idea of how we grapple with the text is very serious. You know, are we dealing with the event itself, or are we dealing with how we pass on the significance of the event? And I think for Sir Syed, just to be clear, the Quran was miraculous. Yes, the highest of any text possible. Why? Because it was provided in the faithfulness of the prophet in responding to God's work in him. But he would say that happened from within internalized human natural means, not by supernatural. So he's not going to embrace a view of revelation that says, God communicated in a way from outside to the inside. It all happens from within a closed cosmology.
I think at that point, maybe we'll carry on this conversation with others joining in as well. Thank you very much so far. There's so much I'd love to ask further about that.